And the first thing that we will look at, it should be obvious, but sometimes it's not, is that we should grieve. There was a book that one of my middle school teachers made me read when I was in 7th grade, and it was a book of it was basically just a series of conversations that the author had with a man who was dying of Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, and the man said something speaking about physical death. I think it's very profound, has a lot of biblical truth behind it. He told the author that death might end a life, but it does not end a relationship. It's important and it's healthy to take time to grieve the loss of that person's physical presence, the transformation of that relationship into a long-distance relationship with difference in communication, difference in presence and relationship. If you look at 2 Samuel chapter 18, 2 Samuel chapter 18, we see David mourning the death of his son Absalom, who led a rebellion against him. And beginning in verse 31, a Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose against you." And the king said to the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" So the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king, and all who rise against you to do you harm, be like that young man." And the king was deeply moved, and he went up to the chamber over the gate, and he wept. And as he went, he said thus, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. O Absalom, my son, my son." And Joab was told, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For all the people heard that day that the king has grieved over his son. And the people stole back into the city that day as people who are ashamed to steal away when they flee in battle. But the king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, "O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son." If you turn back to chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, you'll see a similar treatment given over the death of Saul, who also had tried to kill David. In 2 Samuel chapter 1, in verse 11, David took hold of his own clothes and tore them, and so did all of the men who were with him. And they mourned and they wept and they fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. In verse 17, David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son, and he said to them, to each of the children of Judah, with the song of the bow, indeed it was written in the book of Jasher, "The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places, how the mighty have fallen." So in each of these cases, the people that David mourned included people that had tried to kill him. Absalom, David's son, had led a rebellion against him. He tried to overthrow his reign and take over his kingdom. And David had instructed his captains to deal gently with Absalom because he was his son. He wanted his captains to take him peacefully if possible. But Joab instead put 3 spears through his torso as he was stuck in a tree. The people expected David to rejoice at the destruction of his enemies. But this was David's son, and he was distraught. And when it reads that he said thus, "Absalom, my son, Absalom," you know he wasn't just saying that. That was uncontrollable screaming in distress at the thought of the death of his son. He was unable, could not stop screaming his son's name, and even begged he even wished to have traded places with his son. And again, at the death of Saul and Jonathan, David was expected to rejoice at the death of his enemy Saul, and yet he tears his clothes and he mourns, and he mourns the loss of the Lord's anointed. And for his friend Jonathan, he writes this song, the song of the bow. In that song, there's a line where it says, "I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war perished." So even at the deaths of enemies, David wept. This is a necessary, it is a healthy, and it is a human reaction to death. And of course, we might think about the great loss suffered by Job. If you look in Job chapter 1, the death of Job's 10 children. Job gives us the perfect picture of righteous mourning. When it says in verse 20, "Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped." And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with any wrong. And so Job recognized in his grieving that all of the good things in his life came from God, that they were gifts from God, and ultimately, God was in control of those things. And even when Job's wife's faith was destroyed by her grief, in Job chapter 2, Job's faith remained. In Job chapter 2 and verse 9, his wife said to Job, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. But Job said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. And so at this point, Job mourned in a way that maintained his good relationship with God because he recognized God's authority. And he recognized God as the source of all of life's blessings. And those blessings included the time that he had gotten to spend with his 10 deceased children. Even while he was mourning their deaths, he could express thanks for their lives. Even Jesus, who is a perfect example of all things, he took time to mourn the death of his friend Lazarus in John chapter 11. In John chapter 11, beginning in verse 1, a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who had anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. And when Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified through it. And Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. In verse 11, he tells his disciples, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I might wake him up. His disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. However, Jesus spoke of his death, and they thought that he was speaking about taking rest and sleep. And Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. So we're actually told that Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And you might read that and you might think, well, duh, it's Jesus. He loves everyone. I think that sometimes that we forget that Jesus was God, but he was also a man. And yes, Jesus does love everyone. He loves the whole world, even to the point that he was willing to die so that whoever wants to follow him can be saved. But Jesus also had very close physical relationships while he was on earth. He had a father and he had a mother who raised him. He had younger brothers and younger sisters. He even had Jewish brethren who he grew up attending synagogue with, just like we attend church with one another. And he had close friends like Mary and Martha and Lazarus, whom he loved very dearly. In verse 17, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary was sitting in the house, and Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha said, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. But Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And she said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. And when she had said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary, her sister, saying, the teacher has come and is calling out for you. As soon as she heard that, she rose quickly and came to him. Jesus had not come yet into the town, but was in the place where Martha met with him, and the Jews who were with her in the house, and comforting her, when they saw Mary, rose up quickly and went out and followed her, saying, she is going to the tomb to weep there. But when Mary came to Jesus, where he was, and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So when Jesus and the disciples get to Bethany, Lazarus was already dead. He had been dead for a long time. Everyone was mourning. Both Mary and Martha find out that Jesus is there, and they greet him in the same way. They come to him, they worship, or they fall down at his feet, and they say, if you were here, this would not have happened. In verse 37, the Jews said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man over here also have saved this man from dying?" There's a certain amount of faith in those statements. There's a recognition that Jesus had the power, he had the authority, he had the miraculous ability to save Lazarus or to prevent Lazarus' death. But there's also some accusatory undertones to those things. They're almost saying, if you were here, this wouldn't have happened. Where were you, Jesus? We told you he was sick. If you were only here, this never would have happened. Where were you? And I think that that's a common feeling when people are grieving. Where is God when I need him the most? If he were only here, this never would have happened. He had the power to help this situation over here. He helped this person, and he healed them. But where was he for me and for my loved ones when I needed him? But Jesus is here in the story of Lazarus. He is there for their mourning. He's there for their weeping. And he joins with them. He feels their pain. And he feels our pain today. In verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in his spirit and was troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept. And the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Jesus sympathized with the loss of Lazarus because he loved Lazarus. He wept at the grave of his friend, just as we weep at the graves of our loved ones. And yet Jesus knew that Lazarus would not stay dead. He knew that he was about to raise him from the dead. Lazarus was only going to be in the tomb for 5 days. He was going to come out and rejoin the living. And as we will talk about shortly, we know that our brethren who are dead will not stay dead either. But that does not mean that we don't need to take time to grieve. Jesus wept. Maybe even more significantly than his sympathy, Jesus had empathy with the pain of Mary and with Martha. It was when he witnessed their pain and their weeping that it says that he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15 tells us that we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but he was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. And grief is most definitely one of those human weaknesses that Jesus experienced and that he understands. We think about all of those close relationships, physical relationships that Jesus had in his life as a man. He had 33 years on this earth, and he experienced loss and death of his loved ones. He gets that. The next verse, Hebrews 4 and verse 16, reads that we can come boldly to the throne of grace that we might obtain mercy and find grace in times of need, to help us in times of need. And we generally think about that passage as it relates to dealing with sin, but it relates to our grief as well. It is a weakness that Jesus can help us with. It is a weakness that Jesus understands. And as we grieve, Jesus knows what that is like. And we can boldly approach God in prayer to help us with that struggle. Because our God... In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, it says, beginning in verse 3, "Blessed be the Lord, be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our tribulation, that we might be able to comfort those who are in any trouble, with the comfort with which we also ourselves are comforted by God. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Christ." So God is the God of comfort. He's the Father of mercies. And when we are enduring hard things, we can count on him for comfort. But it's interesting that the verse reads that God comforts us in our tribulations so that we can comfort other people in their tribulations and in their troubles. How quickly the attention gets off of me receiving comfort and needing comfort, and onto me giving comfort to other people. And I don't think that that's by accident. I think that's by design. If we remain concerned with ourselves, thinking about ourselves, and being concerned about ourselves, rather than thinking of and helping other people, that's when we give opportunity to spiral and to let our grief become out of control. But when we take the verse and apply it, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, Let each esteem others better than himself. We develop that servant mindset that focuses less on ourselves and more on others. We don't have time to spiral because we have people to help. We also see that comfort that's talked about in 2 Corinthians 1, the comfort with which we are to comfort others, is the same comfort that we receive from God. We see at least part of that explained if you drop down to verse 9. It says, yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivers us from so great a death, and does deliver us, in whom we trust that he will still deliver us. There's great comfort in that God delivers his children from sin and will deliver them even from physical death. Physical death is not the end of life for a Christian. And if that doesn't comfort us, then I don't know what will.